Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Bangalore International Center for inviting me, and to Ravi and all the other people that made this event happen. And thank you also to my interlocutors for the evening, Sushmita and Rajendran. I look forward to our conversation. I imagine that since some of you might know something about the book, but I thought it would be good to give you some sense of what the book is about. And so I'd make a short presentation, and then we'll go into the conversation with the discussants today. So beginning in the mid-20th century, the Indian planning process was one of the post-colonial world's most ambitious experiments. Between 1950 and 2014, the Indian economy was a planned one. The five-year plan was the vehicle chosen by the independent Indian state to overcome, in its own language, centuries of colonial exploitation. It was a novel experiment, an arranged marriage, as it were, between liberal democratic institutions like a parliament and Soviet-inspired economic planning, at a time when the Cold War presented these two options as fundamentally incompatible, both intellectually and institutionally. With each five-year plan, the Planning Commission set the gears of the nation's economy in motion, and its pronouncements rippled across the land to every farm and factory. My book really tries to explore how planning became so central to the story of modern India, how it became almost a national obsession, something that was once even seen, surprisingly today, as an exciting adventure. Today, when we look back on those years, we forget how mainstream the planning process was. But without understanding, it's hard to come to terms with why, for example, the five-year plans were once a theme in Bollywood songs in the 1950s and 1960s. Why, for example, did the plans show up in movies, in plays, in songs, and in the popular culture of the era? My book tries to recreate that period and explain why that was. It uses planning as a lens to understand the independent Indian nation state. It's not just about the economy, but really also about how planning captured the imagination, not just of India's intelligentsia, but also that of the public sometimes even. So during the formative decades of the Republic, planning was an idea that really governed the nation. So much so that it often became the butt of cartoonist jokes. The plans were meant to be the route to economic transformation, and it also became the language through which aspirations for nation building were expressed, and it became a fixture in the national conversation. So this is a cartoon by Shankar from 1950, and it's sort of poking fun at how the government seemed to have a plan for almost everything, right? There's an economic plan, there's a defense plan, there's an all-up plan, there's a Congress plan, and of course, in the sort of very gendered language of the era, the butt of the joke is that there's even a plan, a children's plan, and a daughter's plan, and a wife's plan. By the time India became independent, planning had been a popular idea in the country for at least 2 decades. Over the 1930s and 1940s, planning had emerged as a dominant idea across the political spectrum. This is something that we often forget. We think of it as only a left-wing idea, but across the political spectrum at the time, planning was the language that was used for economic modernization. Its supporters included prominent technocrats and engineers like Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya, Meghnad Saha, major anti-colonial leaders like Nehru, of course, but also Rabindranath Tagore and Subhash Chandra Bose. It included even India's leading capitalists like J.R.D. Tata, G.D. Birla, Purushottam Das Thakurdas, and Lala Shriram. Planning was an idea that was not just popular in India, but globally at the time as well. In the mid-20th century, there were planned economies in China and the Soviet Union, of course, but also in Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, France, Argentina, Ghana, Sudan, and Tanzania, amongst many others. Planning in India, therefore, was just part of this global wave of planning. So in the first part of my book, I argued that planning triggered the development of data infrastructures that dramatically expanded the state's footprint, particularly its ability to govern the economy. Centralized planning required numerical mastery of the economy, which provoked this rapid growth in data infrastructure. This new infrastructure, which was specifically a new statistical infrastructure and a pioneering computer program, has ever since been central to India's development ambitions. And I try to tell the story through the fascinating character of Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis, who is a brilliant scientist, India's foremost economic planner, and one of the most influential Indians of his generation. And through the meteoric rise of an institute that went from being a once marginal academic institute to the country's most influential policy-making body, the Indian Statistical Institute. Born in 1893 in colonial Calcutta, Mahalanobis grew up in a very culturally refined household. He grew up to be a physicist, educated at Presidency College in Calcutta and then at King's College in Cambridge. He was brilliant, he was charismatic, he was serious, and he was enormously self-assured, arrogant in the words of many. He was also multifaceted. He was well-versed in ancient Sanskrit verses. He possessed a discerning ear for Bengali poetry. He was an expert in Rabindranath Tagore's poetry and also a dabbler in architecture, though his colleagues at the time thought that his abilities as an architect were dubious, though they were afraid to tell him so. Mahalanobis was really animated by a sense of purpose, and that purpose was that he wanted his academic work to be of national significance. His interest in statistics began quite by accident, and for a few decades he wore two hats. One as a lecturer of physics back on his return from Cambridge at Presidency College in Calcutta, but also becoming India's leading statistician on the side. Over time, he would become, over the 1930s and 40s, a global pioneer in the use of large-scale sample surveys, which were conducted through the Indian Statistical Institute, which he had founded in the early 1930s, in 1931. By the time of independence in 1947, Mahalanobis was internationally recognized for his contributions to sample surveys, which were increasingly coming to be used not just in India, but across the world. Over the next few decades, in independent India, Mahalanobis would design the National Sample Survey, which we still use in India today. He would bring India its first two digital computers and author the enormously significant Second Five-Year Plan, which broadly laid the template not just for India's economy in the late 1950s, but lays out the blueprint for what India's economy will look like until market liberalization in the early 1990s. In other words, Mahalanobis is a very, very significant figure in Indian history. India's data capacities were revolutionized by the National Sample Survey that Mahalanobis was integral and the Indian Statistical Institute were integral in setting up. It began in 1950 in response to the state's need for data. It was begun because the Planning Commission needed data for the five-year plans. Mahalanobis and the Institute were integral to setting it up. It was quite simply the biggest and most comprehensive sampling inquiry ever done in the world until then. The challenges were enormous. Mahalanobis would write in his diary, which are held at his sort of home in Calcutta until today. He would write in his diary about the forested areas in Orissa where investigators had to be accompanied by armed guards through forests, about snow-clad Himalayan passes that these investigators had to go through, about encountering tribals or Adivasis in Assam where they didn't speak any language that were known to the investigators and who scoffed, in the words of these investigators, at the idea of money and development. In other parts, investigators fell ill due to tropical diseases or feared for their lives due to man-eating tigers being in these forests. But the results were transformative. Since then, from 1950 till today, the National Sample Survey has consistently yielded fine-grained, detailed results, details about economic life in India, helping assess poverty, employment, consumption, and expenditure. It has made contributions to policy making at a global level as well. The methods pioneered by the National Sample Survey are now used by the World Bank and the United Nations in their household surveys conducted in more than 100 countries. As the Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton has said, where Mahalanobis and India led, the rest of the world has followed. But this sudden fountain of data, this gushing hose of data from the National Sample Survey posed its own problems. How do you crunch all these numbers? The solution was a revolutionary new technology that was now being discovered across the world, that was now appearing on the horizon, digital computers. And they became an obsession for Mahalanobis, who spent a decade and a half bringing India its first digital computers. In the book, I track how Mahalanobis, or the professor, as many of his contemporaries referred to him, and as how he sometimes referred to himself, how the professor traveled the east coast of America, hopping from university to another, from Harvard to Princeton to Columbia, and numerous others, learning about this rare and dizzyingly expensive new technology called the computer, sometimes called the digital brain or the electronic brain at the time. From there, from the United States, he traveled to Europe and the Soviet Union, from where he was able to bring India its first two computers. This is a picture of Mahalanobis and his wife, Nirmala Kumari Mahalanobis, with the physicist, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Niels Bohr on the computer floor of the Ural, which is one of the first computers India got from the Soviet Union. This was taken in 1960. What's important to remember is that these two computers were some of the earliest computers in Asia. In fact, India got its first computer. It was only the second Asian nation to get a computer. And there were very few countries in the world that had computers at the time. America had computers, Japan had two computers, the Soviet Union had computers, and England had computers. So, and the places where these computers were first being built and used, they were all used for military purposes. But in India, it was kind of sort of a marked deviation from them. India, it was being used for development purposes. But the reason that it was so hard to get these machines, the reason why Mahalanobis spent a decade of his life trying to get two computers to India is because of how expensive they were. So the UNIVAC, which was the sort of acronym for the Universal Computer, was the world's leading computer, was housed at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. It was the first computer to sort of transfer into popular culture. There were images of the UNIVAC in Superman comics, etc. But the UNIVAC costed $1 million for one machine, and it costed an extra $200,000 for upkeep. So this was out of the question for the Indian government to buy, or certainly for the Indian Statistical Institute to buy, and therefore India had to rely on patrons such as the American government or the Soviet government to donate one to India. And that's why it was so difficult for India to get its first computers. But Mahalanobis and the Institute led this campaign to bring India this revolutionary new technology, and as I go into the book, it leads to many snags because the person at the forefront of bringing this technology to India, Mahalanobis himself, is thought of as a communist threat by the American government, though they don't tell him that. And so for many years, Mahalanobis is after the UNIVAC computer, not knowing that in secret, confidential, now declassified documentation by the US government, they're saying that we will not grant this to Mahalanobis because he is a communist. But it is this ability to create this data infrastructure through the Statistical Institute and the professor that leads to a statistician turning into a policymaker. It allows Mahalanobis to burnish his credentials as an economic policymaker, and it is how a professor of physics ultimately becomes India's most powerful economist and policymaker. Now, the second half of my book flips the narrative of these elite technocrats on its head and looks at how the government tried to make planning popular amongst its citizens. This is a part of the story that I think is less well known amongst us, in that we know of planning as a technocratic and elite enterprise, but I discovered that planning was also sought to be a social movement. And it was through this slogan of democratic planning, a phrase that's bandied about in government through the 1950s and 60s, that the government tries to actuate it or bring it into life. The Congress Party had committed to this phrase, democratic planning, well before independence. In fact, I found the first reference to it in Nehru's handwritten notes as early as 1939. By asking governments to participate in democratic planning, the government was not simply asking for their consent on economic policy. It was also asking citizens to step up to this new political project of building a new kind of state through mass participation. And what animated this idea, I'm sorry that these slides are so dark, I don't quite understand why that is, but the reasons behind this democratic planning campaign was, one, a sense of idealism that was shared by many people in government, Nehru in particular, the idea that India was embarking on a new kind of state, and this new kind of state is a democratic state, and for planning to be truly democratic and be different from communist planning, that Indian citizens had to be aware about what was happening, and that they needed to be given channels by which they could participate in this endeavor of planning. But aside from the idealism, there's also realpolitik involved. There's also realism involved, and that realism involves a recognition of very limited state capacity, especially right after independence. And thirdly, there's the aspect of planning, legitimizing the state, fusing the idea of the government in the minds of the voters as being involved in the business of developing India. So these are the three reasons that I think that this whole project of democratic planning was so central to the government's sort of the image that is projected about itself. I find that there are many cartoons from this era that talk about democratic planning, and this is a cartoon by R.K. Lakshman in a government magazine called Yojana, which was, by the way, was edited by Khushwant Singh, the famous novelist and columnist. And in this cartoon, you see that the plan is represented as an ass, as a sort of obstinate donkey that refuses to move in the direction of prosperity, and it refuses to move in the direction of prosperity despite cajoling, pushing, and pulling, despite the carrot of foreign aid you see here. And the only way in which it moves forward is if these people, citizens of India, carry it on its back. And so what's happening here is that the government is telling individuals and the citizens of India that not only is the plan is not something that we are giving to you, but the plan can only succeed, and you can't complain about the plan not succeeding unless you participate in it. And how are citizens supposed to participate in it? You're supposed to participate by investing in the ways that the government would like you to increase the savings rate. You can participate by volunteering time, for example, building a bund, helping lay a road in your village. These are the ways in which you can participate in it. And this is not so alien to a generation of Indians who had spent decades in an anti-colonial movement, right? The idea that just because we've been given independence, that we will suddenly become an economic superpower is alien to them. And so the idea that the government can ask for them to participate in national movements for economic development is seen as normal at the time. But the Indian state asks people to participate, and it tries to spread this message in an amazing variety of ways. So one of the ways is, of course, through the Films Division of India. And for the people who are sort of older in this audience, you remember that before every film, there used to be sort of 10 minutes of documentaries played by the Films Division of India, often very boring, sometimes entertaining, not any that I saw when I was going to the films, but certainly from the 1950s and 60s, some of them were entertaining. In the second half of the 20th century, the Films Division of India is the largest documentary film producer in the world. Its audience was massive, about 80 million per week, according to Films Division, and it is telling that of all the films ever produced by the Films Division between 1949 and 72, the largest by a distance, nearly 40%, related to development and planning. One such film, one of the more entertaining ones that I saw, this is from 1967, is called Shadow and Substance, which shows an alien visiting India, and the sort of the gambit of the film is that the alien visits India every 5 years. And so while the villager, who's supposed to represent you and me, the Indian citizen, is not able to see any change in his life every 5 years, but because the alien visits from a different planet every 5 years, through the eyes of the alien, you can see how India is transforming. So you see steel improving, you see pakka sort of houses being built, and from 1961 to 63, just happens to be the years of the third five-year plan, you see this sort of house of this villager going from before this being a hutment to becoming sort of a full-fledged home with all the modern comforts of an electric fan, a desk and table, etc. In fact, the house comes to be named Sukhnivas, which is sort of a house of comfort by the end. But while democratic planning was a state-sponsored campaign, propaganda even, the popular culture of the time gives us ample evidence of how planning also seeped into the public consciousness. The five-year plans found their way into commercial cinema and into popular movie songs and popular movies. And one such movie which had plan consciousness, another phrase that the government liked to use, not class consciousness, which divides people, but plan consciousness, which everyone can share, right? The industrialist can share it, the merchant can share it, but so can the worker in the factory share it. One such film was K. Abbas's Char Dil Char Rahein, Four Hearts, Four Paths, released in 1959. It starred box office draws like Meena Kumari, Raj Kapoor, and Shami Kapoor. By the end of the film, all principal characters in the film are building a road towards Nav Bharat, or New India. As a character in the movie says, the road that they are building is no ordinary road. It is a part of our Panchvarshiya Yojana, a part of our five-year plan. The 1950s even had a Bollywood song that featured the five-year plans in its chorus. Right? Imagine being a young person in the 1950s. There is a non-negligible chance that you were humming a song about a five-year plan while having a bath. Right? So that's the sense we need to recapture, the sense that it had really filtered into the public consciousness. And I'm sorry that you can't perhaps see the lyrics here, but it says, "Keh do ye gaon ke jaat ko aur sheher ke gentleman ko, कामयाब हम करके रहेंगे 5 साल के plan को," which means that tell this to the Jats of the village and the gentlemen in the city, we will ensure the success of the five-year plan. And this is a chorus that is sung by Lata Mangeshkar and Mohammad Rafi, right? So again, mainstream singers, very big stars. In the time that I have remaining today, I want to give you a taste of the sheer extent to which this so-called democratic planning went. On 19th February 1956, the government of India embarked on a very strange project. approximately 50 sadhus, Hindu holy men, met with government ministers and parliamentarians to form the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. The idea was for these sadhus to help with the 5-year plans. The main backers of this organization was the then President of India, President Rajendran Prasad, and the then Minister of Planning, Gulzar Lal Nanda. Gulzar Lal Nanda was a longtime Gandhian, a labor union activist, and also, for the history nerds, a 2-time interim Prime Minister of India, right? So not a marginal politician, very much a mainstream politician, also became the Home Minister under Indira Gandhi. The Bharat Sadhu Samaj's combination of the spiritual with the sadhus and the material with the 5-year plans proved irresistible to the American press, of course. And, oh wow, you can't see this at all. I don't know why this is happening, but these are these are news captures from the New York Times and the Washington Post in June and February of 1956. The India correspondent for the New York Times, for example, reported a piece titled, "India's Holy Men Get Worldly Job, Wandering Sadhus Asked to Say a Good Word for the Goals of the 5-Year Plan." The link between these ascetics and the ruling party was in fact so evident, and again it might seem strange today, but that these sadhus were branded by the Jansangh, the version 1.0 of the BJP. The Jansangh referred to these sadhus as Congress sadhus, right? So this was seen as a Congress enterprise, as an enterprise in which the Congress was trying to use Hinduism as part of its politics. Cartoonists, of course, had a field day once again. Here you see Gulzar Lal Nanda, who was then the Minister of Planning, dressed as a sadhu. This is another cartoon from Shankar's Weekly. This is Nehru and V.T. Krishnamachari, the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, presenting the second 5-year plan to an obviously emaciated Indian peasant. Mahalanobis is here as one of the chefs. Obviously a pretty poor chef, given that the customers are hungry. The experiment of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj would eventually blow up in the Congress government's face. Again, there is some sort of issue with all the newsprints that I had here. So let's just maybe go back to this. But basically, in 1966, the sadhus, who always had their own agenda, and they were not as invested in the 5-year plans as the government was, the sadhus demanded a ban on cow slaughter and attacked parliament, vandalizing parts of central Delhi, leading to clashes with the police, and leading to the army having to be deployed in central Delhi for the first time since partition. Several sadhus died. In fact, now this event has become a central plank of the RSS's sort of mythology of the persecution of Hindus, in which their estimates are 500 to thousands of sadhus were killed. No news report from the time, both domestically or internationally, has a report of any more than 8 being killed, but they were fired upon by the police as part of this violence that they were part of. The Home Minister at the time happened to be Gulzar Lal Nanda, who was the primary patron of these sadhus, and because he was so closely associated with the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, he was forced to resign by Indira Gandhi. Furthermore, in a sense of how this endeavor boomeranged in the face of the Congress government, one of the founders of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj was a man named Sant Tukdoji Maharaj. So this is another cartoon sort of making fun of Nehru's association with the Sadhu Samaj, asking for whose salvation. These are some reports in the Times of India and the Guardian at the time of the holy men on rampage in Delhi. Sant Tukdoji Maharaj was one of the founders, one of the people who was at that early meeting in 1956 at Birla Mandir in Delhi, founding the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. Sant Tukdoji Maharaj would also become one of the founders of the VHP, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, right? Again, an organization that was just sort of obviously devoted to a kind of politics that eventually, as we see in the 1980s till today, is in opposition to what the Congress's political platform is, at least, whether you believe it to be sincerely held or not. And by the 1980s, you see that the Bharat Sadhu Samaj and its meetings at, say, at religious events, its meetings, they share the same shamiana and the same pandal as the VHP. And then the speakers for the Bharat Sadhu Samaj are speaking alongside the VHP, arguing for the bringing down of a mosque called Babri Masjid, right? So you see how the politics of today is very much linked in some ways to the politics of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, and how the Bharat Sadhu Samaj blows up in the face of the Congress party. The history that my book explores in some ways echoes in our present time. And here are just quickly some news stories from the past 5 years, and this is what I'll end with. some news stories from the past 5 years that bring the story that I tell from the 1950s onwards to the present. So, for example, in the 2019 election, a very ill-fated election for this individual, as we know, Rahul Gandhi promised to bring back the Planning Commission. The idea was that Modi had got rid of this vestige of the Nehruvian economy and of the Nehruvian dispensation, and that he would bring it back. Mamata Banerjee, in campaigning in Bengal, said that she would like to form a planning commission in Bengal, again giving you a sense of the traction that this idea continues to have in some quarters, and that she would populate this planning commission with Abhijit Banerjee, Amartya Sen, etc. And there are different ways in which the echoes of those times still resound today. This is a piece in the Business Standard asking who the BJP's Mahalanobis will be. This is us hankering for technocracy that exists even till today. For example, Sunil Khilnani referred to Manmohan Singh as the Mahalanobis of the 1990s. And of course, the data infrastructure that was built in the 1950s seems to be either under attack or subjected to willful neglect, according to your own political preferences. And we see evidence of this. Even financial newspapers have made note of this. Here it is, repairing the house that Mahalanobis built. And The Economist a few months ago talked about how India's once vaunted statistical system is now crumbling. So, as I've tried to convince you in this sort of short talk, planning was very much central to the idea and to the story of modern India. In the decades after independence, it was an integral part of politics, of its society, of its economy for sure, but even of its popular culture. In fact, even something as seemingly distant from planning and five-year plans as Hinduism was sort of wrought into an awkward relationship with it. Hopefully this serves as an appetizer for the book and maybe encourages even some of you to read it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion with our interlocutors. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to comment on this book, on this fabulous and very, very important book for our times. Also because there is not a lot written on this period between 50s and 60s in terms of planning. Much of what we have is a detailed account of what these plans were about, right? The different kinds of policies, the different kinds of directions. What we did not have until Nikhil's book was a broader account of plans' relationship with democracy itself. The other reason I'm very, very pleased to be here is also because it struck a nostalgic chord with me, because I grew up in one of these planned towns that were that is besides the kind of planning that Nikhil is talking about. I grew up in Bokaro's Steel City, which is a small township in Jharkhand, which is built from, if I can say, scratch, in the middle of nowhere, and it was developed around a steel industry, a steel township, inhabited by modern scientific engineers with a scientific temper. I was that odd kid who went about in her college introducing herself as I am from Bokaro's Steel City, and everybody found it bizarre and odd. Anyway, so I was growing up in the 1990s when much of this Nehruvian ideology, much of this enthusiasm around the plan was already dead. Bokaro Steel City was already a crumbling township. It was making losses year on year. I very vividly remember that there was for the first time, there's a specific union ministry portfolio that is introduced, which is a disinvestment portfolio. And Arun Shourie is made the disinvestment union minister. And I still remember in those times, we lived in a little bit of a fear as to when will our fathers be asked to resign, or not resign as much as be asked to take voluntary retirement, because that was again a new kind of innovation that had been done at this time, which is that of voluntary retirements. Anyway, so that's, but at the same time, Bokaro was every bit of the kind of planning that Nikhil does talk about. The title of the book, though, I think it's very simple, Planning Democracy. I think it conveys precisely what this book is trying to do. I think it's not a book around planning as much as it's about looking at democracy and democratic institutions through the lens of planning. I think by not going into the content of the plan, but rather into the intent of this plan, I think Nikhil is making a very interesting and a valuable contribution by linking what these plans were doing to the nature of democracy itself. So as much as this book conveys decisiveness, it also conveys, it also tells us about the roads not taken. It also tells us about roads grudgingly taken. It talks about fragile male egos and competition for power and how that shapes the nature of these institutions themselves. To me as a reader, I felt that the book is written through this precise conflict, right? As in, what democracy is supposed to be, but how democracy is being shaped through these conflicts. So what I'll try to do today is flag maybe 4 or 5 such conflicts in order to give the audience an idea as to how Nikhil, as to how I read the book. So on one hand, the first primary conflict that I felt was, on one hand, the plan is supposed to be a scientific kind of an endeavor. It is being thought of, economics is being seen as something that's scientific, that's mathematical, that can be gotten to a perfect formula. And it's quite interesting that Mahalanobis himself is a physicist. So he is trying to make economy, or look at economy as if it were matter, as if it were something of which has its own properties, it has its own characteristics. So he's trying to get it to its scientific sort of a precision, right? But on the other hand, it's more than that. It's also an affect. It's also an emotion. It's also supposed to be it's supposed to mean things to people, right? It's supposed to evoke this kind of sentiment in people, which Nikhil so nicely talked about. So that's one kind of a conflict that I see. The second kind of a conflict that I see is one that of the story of building institutions and the story of personality cults. And I thought this is fascinating because this book tells us the painstaking story of how these makers of modern India were thinking of building these institutions in themselves, but also institutions of democracy, right? But on the other hand, these were also iconic men. So these are democratic institutions which are built by not so democratic men themselves. So, and and I was thinking about reflecting on our contemporary times, probably this is in a way a crisis of democracy today also that we see, whether we look at our political parties, whether we look at our parliament, whether we look at any of these institutions, we see that these democratic institutions have somehow been undercut and been weakened by the makers themselves, right? In such a way that these institutions have risen and fallen with their makers. And the moment there is a vacuum, those institutions also crumble along with them. So my question to you is, do you see that this is where the crisis of Indian democracy really lies, that we haven't been able to come out of this personality cult? We haven't been able to really build democratic institutions which would stand on their own, right? Which would stand on their own merit. So that's my primary question to you. The other thing that I was also, I think, struck by in Nikhil's book is this conflict between democracy as an institution and democracy as a culture. Now, I teach in a law institute where my students very self-assuredly feel that all they have to do is come up with good laws. once you have good laws, once you have good structure and good institutions, that's all that's our democracy lacks, right? And I have to constantly remind them that, you know what, democracy is a culture. No institution will be perfect if there is no democratic culture around it. But my question is, this is also something that I grapple with, and I see that this is something that you have a take on, which is cultures are built, right? Cultures are also a pedagogic project. And my sense of, and this is what you say about planning, as to this planning process is made into a pedagogic kind of a project as well. And that is why it becomes alienating to people in some level, because people are not necessarily connecting to it in the same way that the institution wants them to, right? A similar criticism has historically been made of also the Indian Constitution, right? That the Indian Constitution is also a similarly alien document which was made by an elite a bunch of people, the Constituent Assembly being an elite group of people, which did not necessarily reflect the aspirations of India, right? And that is the reason of, quote unquote, the failure of Indian Constitution. Now, there is another perspective to look at it, which would say that the point of the Indian Constitution was not to reflect the current ethos of its people. It had to aspire for something more. It had to aspire for something bigger, something much larger, right? And that is why there is meaning in fighting for the Indian Constitution. So what my question to you is there something salvageable in this pedagogic exercise, however flawed, however complicated that might be when it comes to planning? So that's something that I was thinking about, whether this, what is the space for our pedagogic projects essentially set for failure, or is there something that's important that can possibly happen through it? The third interesting, let's say, contradiction that I found, conflict that I found in his work, is that of a very masculine plan and the feminist subject, right? So these plans are, as Nikhil quite nicely put it out, are plans and discourses and which are debated and being fought over by these powerful men who are obsessed over data, getting things right in terms of getting creating numbers and crunching data, and also the project of creating a national economy, right? It's the first time a set of people have started this project of charting out a new economic kind of, a national kind of economy, right? So what is this space for national economics in India, right? So these are the men who are possibly thinking of it. But there are also women who you talk about in snatches, and I wanted to hear more from you on that, who are contributing to these discussions, who are saying that, what about domestic labor? What about the social project of the Planning Commission? Is it only about economy? Is it only about crunching numbers? So what I wanted to know from you is, along with this development of national economy, do we also see a corresponding conversation around feminist economics in India that's also coming up? So if you could talk a little more about it, that would be very, very nice. And my last question to you is, of course, you ended with those contemporary vignettes of how certain political figures are promising reviving Planning Commission and the general scope of plan altogether. But I wanted to hear from you as to, what do you think is the future of planning? Is it, given that we live in a time when actually planning is not possible because much of our economy or much of our, let's say, development projects are mostly piecemeal, are market-led, so we get funds from, say, a metro project here or, say, a bullet train there. Right? There is no, so I think many of us it can be claimed that the problem of Bangalore city is also that there has been no holistic planning. We've just been built things over and so on and so forth, and that's the crisis. Do you see there is space for really the coming back of comprehensive planning in times of neoliberal economy? So on that note, I'll ask Nikhil to respond, but thank you once again for letting me, for giving me the chance to come here. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Sushmita. Thank you for being here, for reading the book so carefully. It is wonderful to have such someone who's engaged with the book in such a rich and sort of thoughtful manner. Your first question was about institutions and personality cults. And I think that is a tension, you're right to identify, that is a tension that runs through the book. And it's why sort of half of the book is about Mahalanobis and half of it is about more broader programs that are meant to reach out in more democratic ways. I think that the challenge, which you alluded to, about whether institutions can outlive personalities, I'd say that it's worth noting that some of these institutions we're talking about, the Indian Statistical Institute for one, the National Sample Survey, Parliament itself, national elections, are all built in this time. We sort of take the Constitution for granted, we take elections for granted, we take Parliament for granted, but they all had to be instituted. And we may disagree with the results at some point or the other. We may even we may talk about how there's an erosion of these institutions themselves through all kinds of things like electoral bonds. We can have that discussion. But I do think that there are some of these institutions that have been durable. But I do not think that any democratic institution is immune from an undemocratic politics. And so, as you said, culture is important. And if a culture turns undemocratic, like during the emergency, you will have institutions you cannot protect the institution from the depredations of a state or a culture that has become undemocratic. And so I think that in some sense that is what we're seeing today. It's what we definitely had seen in a much more blatant manner in the emergency. And I think that in a sense is the challenge that we face as citizens, which is how do you build institutions that are responsive to public needs, but do not buckle under political pressure. And it's a challenge for also our politics, of demanding of our politics that the politicians we elect, even those we vote for, that they do not sort of invade into the space of institutions. And I think that in that, the role of the media, the role of civil society is very important as a way to tell political parties, whichever they might be, that, hey, this is not something that you should be intervening in. But as we see, certainly between 1975 and 77 during the emergency, and again today, when you do have a supine media, then it becomes much harder. It becomes harder when civil society is also on the retreat. It becomes harder for these institutions to have any backers outside of the people that governments put in charge of them. And I speak this as an alumnus of JNU and as an institution that has been vilified as basically producing terrorists. I hope people would accept that present company accepted. And present company, both of us are alumni. And so to see institutions go through this, you realize that no institution really is immune, which is not to say that institutions like JNU were not immune from political influence earlier, but it is to say that we need to find ways in which the politics of the era, no institution can remain immune from politics, but they can hopefully remain immune from political parties. And I think that is a challenge. And so that's what I'd say on that. On democracy as an institution versus a culture, and I think this again goes back to the point I was making in response to your earlier question, I think you're absolutely right. I think that there is no democracy without a democratic culture. I think that institutions on their own, we think of institutions as outliving or being entirely separate from the individuals and the human beings and the citizens that create these institutions and then populate these institutions. And so you can have institutions that degrade, that backslide. You can have democracy itself in which, as is noted by political scientists across the world, you can have electoral authoritarianism, in which a country still conducts elections, but you effectively are an autocracy because, for example, there are no protections for minorities, because the majority does not want protections for minorities, right? So you can have institutions that degrade from the inside, that rot from the inside. And I think that one of the, to me, as a sort of, as a student of history, a very poignant episode is that of Ambedkar between 1946 and his death. A person who's so much of an institutionalist that he believes that laws will be the way for Dalits to advance, that the constitution will be a way for Dalits and other Indians to advance. He, unlike Gandhi, does not believe in culture alone. Gandhi is very much a sort of anti-statist, anti-institutionalist. He believes that culture is the be-all and end-all. Ambedkar, in some ways, in opposition to him, says that no, we need laws, that I cannot wait, as he says, for the Hindu soul to reform itself. I want a law to protect Dalits. But the poignancy is also that when he is making his sort of last speech in front of the Constituent Assembly, he is talking about constitutional morality. And constitutional morality, what is it apart from culture, right? What he's saying is that this document, this amazing document that he bequeaths us, he realizes that it is not enough, that it will not be the salvation of the Indian people, it will not be the salvation of lower castes and Dalits, that you need, as he says, liberty and equality is important, but we will have, as he says, liberty in politics, but we will have inequality in our society and in our economics. That democracy is a sort of very thin topsoil in a very deep strata of inequality. And he says that of the sort of slogans of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity is the most important. And what Indians lack is a sense of fraternity because of caste. And that again comes back to culture. So I think that the tension that you put your finger on very astutely is a tension that Ambedkar is alluding to there, that he's obviously an institutionalist, but he realizes the limitations of these institutions. About the masculine plan and the sort of feminist or feminine subject, you're right, this is a book about, as unfortunately most books about early independent India, maybe even present-day India also, is about big male and very often big male fragile egos. But that does not mean that just because men are populating the narrative, that it is only about men, because gender is an operation even when men are performing it, right? And so one way in which I try to bring out the ways in which the feminine is imagined in this period is through this experiment called Kalyanashri, which is really a sort of venture that was launched in 1956 on the campus of the Indian Statistical Institute. And Kalyanashri means, it was named by Mahalanobis to mean grace and beauty. And it basically became a place on campus which was run by his wife, Nirmal Kumari Mahalanobis, also known as Rani Mahalanobis. And it took in refugees from East Pakistan, mostly women, and set them to work in informal industries like beadi making, making jute, sort of jute-based products, etc. And the idea was to have a sort of laboratory-style experiment on campus, on the Indian Statistical Institute campus, to see what the potentiality is for productivity in informal industry. But the way in which it was named and the way in which it was talked about by Mahalanobis and the people involved, including the person who ran it, the director, Rani Mahalanobis, it was seen, informal industry was seen as feminine industry. It was seen as what women can do at home while child rearing, while taking care of the household as well. And so a lot of the more radical critiques of this masculine economy that was actually made, ironically enough, before independence by women associated with the Congress Party, which went into the National Planning Committee documents, as you mentioned. They even questioned, for example, whether there should be a wage for women at home for taking care of children, for doing domestic labor, that should be treated as remunerative labor. All those critiques go out the window in the 1950s, and feminist scholars have sort of asked for a long time, from the 1980s, why is that so? So Nirmala Banerjee, a sort of a leading scholar, has asked why this was so, and her view is that the reason this happens is that a lot of these women who actually were authors of this document get co-opted into the government, and they believe that their power emanates solely from these powerful men giving them this position, which in a sense clips their wings, that if they make radical gestures, that they will not be given these positions anymore, and that because there isn't a on-the-ground feminist movement or a political movement, again, they depend on the munificence of the state. And so Nehru is more liberal than many of his contemporaries, but that's it. Nehru is also a patriarch in many ways. It also comes in the form of patronage from the state, and it comes in this manner of paternalist benevolence. And so that is all that they can sort of hope for. And so I think that those are some of the ways that I would say, and I point to the career of an amazing lady, Durgabai Deshmukh, who, Durgabai Deshmukh is a social worker, a Gandhian, somebody who participated in the Quit India movement, a sort of a freedom fighter, a criminal lawyer. She is invited by Nehru to be a member of the Planning Commission, the only female member of the Planning Commission. But when she gets the job, she's put in charge of social welfare, right? Something that is already seen as something that women should be doing. And then she gives up her job after marrying Chintaman Deshmukh, who was then the finance minister of the country and also a member of the Planning Commission. And she gives it up to found the Central Social Welfare Board, right? Again, doing something that is seen traditionally as the kind of work that women should be doing. And this is someone who's committed to planning. She named her house in Pune Yojana, which means the plan. But yet, for someone who's so committed to planning, she's sort of hived off into these very sort of quote-unquote feminine sort of pastures of the plan. Thank you again.
Thank you, Nikhil, for the wonderful presentation, and Sushmita for your questions. I just want to start off by thanking Nikhil for this wonderful book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book, and also for giving me an opportunity to be here and participate in this discussion. Now, I think much like Sushmita, there's always there's a personal story associated when you think about plans, when you think about Nehruvian India, and growing up in the 90s especially. I think all of us, at least the two of us, grew up in the 90s. So in that case, I grew up in Calcutta, incidentally. And my father, who was working with the Allahabad Bank, and he was also a Nehruvian in that sense. And so there was a lot of culture about discussing all these matters at home, and there was a wide discussion, debate about everything. And we had a wide spectrum of socialists coming to our house, from the communist to the Vedantic, as you also outline in your book. And incidentally, I happened to be at Indian Statistical Institute as well at some point. And one of the things that struck me was the first time I ever taught in India was in Indian Statistical Institute. And the first course I ever taught was a course for international students. And I wasn't sure why there were international students coming from different countries in Africa, Kazakhstan, to a place like Boranagore in Calcutta. And having taught that course, I realized, okay, when I asked someone, they said, oh, it's an old legacy. And it's only after reading your book that I discovered that this was something that was set up by Mahalanobis himself, because India was so advanced in its thought and work as far as statistics and sampling and household surveys are concerned, that an entire International Students Education Center, ISEC, was set up in ISI Calcutta, and these students used to come every year. So the legacy continued till very late, even after Mahalanobis' time. So I think that's one of the things I think even Nikhil talked about in his presentation, and also very well outlined in the book, and well known to many economists and statistics even today, is that regardless of what the consequences of the plans were, where we are today, I think one of the real landmark contributions of Mahalanobis and the Nehruvian system of planning, etc., is the robust data infrastructure and the statistical infrastructure which was set up as early as 1950. And that's very remarkable given the state we were in, right? We are just coming out of a centuries-old colonial legacy, horrors of partition, multiple things, and yet there was the courage and the vision to set up something like that, which is central. It's very unfortunate how the fact that it's dysfunctional today. I'd like to start by, first of all, giving the context. One of the things that I recall from reading Ram Guha's book, India After Gandhi, where Guha says, and he quotes, and he says, the French writer André Malraux once asked Jawaharlal Nehru what had been his greatest difficulty since independence. And Nehru responded by saying, creating a just state by just means. And then he added, perhaps too, creating a secular state in a religious country. And I think that really, these two lines by Nehru actually summarize a lot of things, and the messiness that Nikhil talks about in his book. So I just want to flag off by some key questions that I felt from the book and from other experiences of reading that were key questions for Nehru at that time. One is, okay, India had multiple forms of precarity, right? So as I said, as he also said, coming out from the colonial legacy, then the horrors of partition, etc. Then the second thing is India was dealing with extreme poverty and inequality. We are just also, India had witnessed massive famines, and famine was a major preoccupation for a lot of people, politicians, economists, and anyone else. The third was the question of national unity and security. That was a central preoccupation back then. The fourth was a question of sovereignty and the need to build national pride. Now, that's again a very critical component and an important integral part of Nehru's decision making. So, combining all of this was also that we had a wonderful constitution to deal with. We had, on the one hand, we had the liberal traditions being incorporated as part of the fundamental rights, individual civil liberties and political liberties. And as you said again, it was important for Ambedkar to set it up because he did not believe, he felt that we need institutional mechanisms. So fundamental rights played a huge role. And on the other hand, we had the social revolutionary strand of the directive principles of state policy, which talk about what should be the kind of policies and frameworks that India should undertake to foster a kind of just and equitable society. So there were many tensions that were pulling the country and pulling the policymakers in various directions. So the country needed to be, India was a jelly-like and malleable state at that time. And it needed molding and anchoring, right? So, and given the multiplicity of these kind of precarities, centralized planning, and one of the important aspects of the plan was the whole idea of import substitution and industrialization. The idea is the whole, a term which has become very popular today, but it was ingrained in the way the plan was visualized, which is industrialization and import substitution and self-reliance, which has been co-opted now, and we call it Atmanirbharta. So, without which I believe, and I think it's up for debate, obviously, that without a kind of centralized planning architecture at that time, given the kind of multiplicity of precarities, there's a high chance that India would have completely imploded. Now, that's the context in which we need to read the entire book also. And for all the criticisms, it is also important to foreground some important economic aspects here. And this has been, there is a recent book by Bala, and it's a kind of companion book because it talks about Indian economy from Nehru's time to Modi's time. And one of the things he also articulates in the book, he furnishes data, is that India witnessed a growth rate that was 4 times higher in the Nehru era compared to the pre-colonial era. And the per capita income was 19 times more during the Nehru phase of the first 3 plans compared to the pre-colonial time. Also the fact that there was an increase in the birth rate, which is actually a sign of optimism of people in the economy. So these are, I just wanted to foreground some important economic facts because it's very easy to get into a criticism of the centralized planning, architecture, and so on and so forth. So I think one of the questions is, of course, how could authority be centralized so that national unity and all these things can be promoted? And one of the other things which also Nehru alluded to is that how, while applying the rule of law, would social economic reform be fostered and democratic institutions strengthened in a society in which religion and tradition sanctioned inequality. So that's an important, and sanctioned inequality and exploitation, right? So that's the, and now I just want to say that the book is a fascinating exploration of 2 very seemingly disparate themes which are connected and woven together with a lot of care, wit, and meticulous research. So many thanks for that. Data appears to be a very dry thing, but data and the messiness of implementing the politics of it, the messiness of democracy in implementing all these things, were the 2 main but discordant protagonists of this book, I would say. And as Nikhil writes on page 108, maybe I'll just read out a couple of lines because there are some remarkable lines in this book which are very literary, actually. One of the things which I found extraordinary was when he said, planning was a technocrat's theme park. It's a very terse line, but a very powerful line, which is unfortunately assumed it's become a real theme park today. So I'll just maybe read out this, for example, page 108. Before I pose the questions, I think I'll read out a couple of lines, if it's okay. I should have had post-its. Yeah. So towards the end of the chapter on chasing computers, where he talked about how Mahalanobis is so interested in getting digital infrastructure and computing in place because we are collecting massive amounts of data from the people. And he says, looking back at the changes it wrought in India's statistical systems and computing abilities, its significance to the Indian state's data capacities is evident. But the exaltation of experts and the elite nature of planned debates were discordant with the claims of democratic planning that the government was also simultaneously pushing, and to which we will now turn. So this is towards the end of his exploration of data, and then before beginning the discussion on the messiness of implementation. The figures like the professor, the business of persuading citizens about plans, and the rhetoric of democratic planning belonged to the messy politics of implementation, a realm that lacked the neat perfectibility of tables, models, and plan frames. So planning was an elite, expert-driven enterprise, and the nature of this vision rendered ordinary citizens faceless with little agency to shape it. As a result, they're mostly voiceless in their archives. But the people mattered in the context of the Indian state's claims of democratic planning. For reasons of both necessity and ideology, the plans could not succeed without a willing citizenry. And here, he says, technocracy sat uncomfortably, but necessarily beside democracy. So I think that's I thought it was a very important formulation of your entire book. And the book is also very rich in stories and anecdotes, of which some of which are absolutely funny and ironic. For example, to all the economics nerds in this room, on page 74 of the book, there is John Galbraith is commenting on Milton Friedman. It's like he's saying that, maybe it's better to read as opposed to me paraphrasing it. I'll just read it. I think it's better that way. Yeah. So he says, when Mahalanobis spoke about his successful efforts in bringing scholars from all over the world to Calcutta, he mentioned that the American government had offered to send Milton Friedman. Galbraith and Friedman, the American successors to the European Keynes and Hayek, made for easy contrast. The former was an extraordinarily tall Harvard social democrat, the latter an uncommonly short-statured University of Chicago champion of free market. Amused at the thought of the free market evangelist advising the Planning Commission. And remember, the Planning Commission, a lot of it is modeled on Soviet style, right? But Nehru is also very clear that he doesn't want to become a totalitarian state, but a welfare state. So that he's doing a tightrope walk there. So amused at the thought of the free market evangelist advising the Planning Commission, Galbraith quipped, and I quote, "To ask Friedman to advise on economic planning was like asking the Holy Father to counsel on the operations of a birth control clinic," which I thought was incredibly funny. And so the book is full of such excellent anecdotes by famous people, and stories. And one of the stories that really gripped me was the story of this Morton Nadler, who was this American cyber expert, thought of to be a communist, and the kind of travails. And he also happened to be in Calcutta and working at the Indian Statistical Institute. It reads like a John le Carre novel, actually, that story. And so now I think one of the questions I want to begin is, maybe what I'll do is I'll ask one question at a time so that you just get. So I think one of the things, the first question I have is that, given the tense geopolitical situation that India was in, and as we've discussed, the colonial legacy, horrors of partition, high levels of inequality, poverty, let's also not forget the tense geopolitical situation of the Cold War. Because on the one hand, you have America, and the other, Soviet Russia, and here is Mahalanobis, who is shuttling between the two places and getting both countries to agree on a lot of things and get some things. So in this tense kind of situations, one of the things I feel was that perhaps it was a need of the hour to focus on import substitution, etc. So it was a tightrope walk for Nehru, right? But it seems that Nehru operated on the belief that Indians were rational, patient, tolerant, and also as if they had complete faith in Nehru's approach. And that's the kind of vision of implementing this messiness of people agreeing to what your plans are. So in a way, can we say that he wanted, when I say he, I mean Nehru, he wanted or assumed that the polity would have an almost faith-based religious approach to his version of democracy, wherein people would blindly operate and abide by a template of plans or ideas that are dished out to them. And this is inferred from how he championed a small team of elite mathematicians or scientists to create a recipe for an India where he wanted everyone to participate. India was admittedly in the throes of high vulnerability. So are there any debates from that time period that suggest that there were alternate models of democratic participation that were thought or discussed? And connected to that is a theoretical question of what do we understand by participatory democracy within the framework of the liberal tradition? Because what we see unfolding in your book that you describe is not exactly a participatory democracy, but democracy by consent. So if you could just reflect on these two questions. Should I ask the questions? Okay, fine. So maybe I'll just ask the questions and then have Nikhil respond to it. So one of the things, one of the multiple forms of socialisms which we talked about, which ranges, he talks about in the book, is from Vedantic to communism, and I think you should read it, is how is it that some of the very India-specific dimensions, and one of the things that Sushmita alluded to is the gender dimension, which you've responded, but the other important dimension is the dimension of caste, right? Now, Nehru's, yeah. So Nehru, you give an example where Nehru goes to a work site at Damodar Valley Corporation's work, Damodar Valley Dam's work site, and he asks people about why they are doing the work. And people are saying, people are clueless. They're thinking, okay, some work needs to be done. And Nehru takes upon him, and it's almost like a pedagogy for him. He says, no, this is going to be an important path for you, etc., etc. But, and in fact, to quote Nehru, Nehru says that this could combat the fissiparous tendencies and parochial outlooks, and that it would even make the crooked paths of provincialism, communalism, and casteism less tempting. Now, with these ideas in mind, why does one hardly see Gandhi and Ambedkar in the planning discourse? What was the basis of the belief that the collective project of nation building was sufficient to overcome caste and religious dynamics? There's no basis to understand that. So, on the one hand, the plans were conceived and almost marketed as products divorced from these social realities, while on the other, Nehru was deeply sympathetic to these. How can we understand his attempts to reconcile these contradictions? And what were Mahalanobis's thought on these social dimensions? Did he have any? We don't see that much in the book, at least. Again, the next question to you is that you trace a remarkable history of how a figure like Mahalanobis almost single-handedly interacted with the who's who in the world, convincing them about the need for plans, robust data collection practices, etc. And quite ironically, even the biggest free market ideologue, Milton Friedman, actually pokes fun of Mahalanobis by saying that your description of the economy is too mathematical. Unfortunately, economics is not so mathematical and so principled as you described, which is very ironic given that it's coming from Friedman. Then there are so many jump-starting of the economy through heavy industries, etc., etc. But when there was evidence from other countries on the role of primary education and health in overall human development, why did the planners miss that point when there was a commitment to higher education? Can we say that this has led to more unequal outcomes in education over time? Also, India had just recovered from famines, and owing to partition, there was a cut in the supply chains of raw materials from the current-day Bangladesh and Pakistan. So in this context, why wasn't, or is it, maybe I'm missing something, but was there enough public investment in agriculture as well, in addition to heavy industries? And then the last two questions are related to contemporary times, which is, one is, of course, the communal angle, which we can't, the free reign that was given to Bharat Sadhu Samaj. And you write also that to Nanda, the material couldn't be separated from Nanda is Gulzari Lal Nanda, the material couldn't be separated from the spiritual. Economic development was but a mode of national spiritual regeneration. While technocrats like Mahalanobis saw the economy in statistical schedules and input-output tables, Nanda and the Bharat Sadhu Samaj saw the economy on a continuum with the spiritual. It is another measure of the distance that could separate technocratic planning from democratic planning. So Nehru was undoubtedly and resolutely secular. But among numerous examples where Nehru actually was very critical of Prasad going to the inauguration of the Somnath temple, but then we also see Nehru participating in conventions with the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. Government is allotting land in the central part of Delhi to Bharat Sadhu Samaj. And as you said, that Tukudoji Maharaj actually goes on to become a central member of the VHP. So in this attempt at popularizing plans, do you see today's majoritarianism as a legacy from those times? That's one thing. And the last question to you is one more, again, on the economic side and the centralization side. There's a lot of parallels. Of course, there's a big difference, and I think I should make myself clear, as I outlined in the beginning, that the need for centralization at that time was very different. But there seems to be a co-opting of centralization and technocracy today, which is radically different from that time period. And we see that in various ways in which, for example, how digital technology has been used in various kinds of social policies, where institutional accountability is diluted. There's centralization in terms of funds management, the way the taxes are being done. So there is federalism is definitely in peril. Now, Nehru, of course, and the reliance on the vocabulary of self-reliance, the vocabulary of fundamental duties. Nehru also invoked the idea that people have a duty to the nation, so he invoked the spirit of volunteerism. But today we also see an articulation of fundamental duties by the Prime Minister Modi, but the context is very different. We see an obsession about centralized dashboards among policymakers today, which is very different, but the statistical systems are in peril. So we see a very, almost a very bad, we see a contrast, but also parallels between the centralization of that time and the kind of centralization today. So could you reflect a little bit on these questions?
Yeah, okay. I'll just quickly say, what I'd say is that it is primarily a book of history. I'm a historian. I am not an economist. But I do address the contemporary in several chapters, and I do address the ways there are continuities with the past, both within the Congress, but across the Congress and the BJP. And I do flag certain avenues that the Indian state could have taken and chose not to take. But this is not a book that is about India's economic future and solutions for India's economic future. I hope that is not a discouragement from the book, but but perhaps just sort of plain speaking about what the book is really about. Yeah.
You should still pick up the book because it lays out the foundations of what.
I could get the idea, but I was very keen to understand that whether does it cover this aspect.
Yeah, I would say, though, that the history, we imagine we know it well, but as a professional historian, I suppose I'm duty-bound to say that we all know our history much less well than we imagine it to. So I think that perhaps you'll be surprised by also the paths we've taken till here. Thank you so much. Thank you also, Rajendran, for those questions. Again, in the interest of time, I hope you will not mind if I sort of abbreviate my answers a little bit. Your question about Nehruvian sort of instincts towards democracy, but yet his reliance on this very small cabal of elite technocrats. I think that one is to do with predisposition. As Sunil Khilnani writes, Nehru was sort of bound to be seduced by a man like Mahalanobis. But I think that reducing it to personality alone, I think overlooks some structural constraints. One is that India's human resources are extremely limited. I do not mean India's population, which is 350 million, a huge amount, but the number of people who are educated beyond just school and have higher education is extremely limited. India does not have, in the eyes of the government itself, a vast and very competent bureaucracy, though it has a large bureaucracy. And so in some ways, this reliance on technocrats is a way for a government to do the kind of things that it wants to, which are really ambitious, without having to take on the decadal challenges of rearing a cadre of people that can do it, right? And so you have people like Homi Bhabha, you have Vikram Sarabhai, you have Mahalanobis. All of these are individuals who do not rely on the government for pay. Their institutions also do not entirely rely on the government for its functioning, yet they have international clout, and they're willing to work for the government for almost free. right? So it's a way, I think, for the government to also get these things done based on the agency of these individuals who want to do it in any case. And so then the Nehruvian government, and in fact Nehru himself, becomes a sort of enabler for these projects, right? And so, but it leads to this sort of what in other situations you might call clientelism. And so you might think of it, if you're opposed to planning, as a failure in the economy, but the same kind of practice and patronage leads to India's space program, ISRO. It also leads to India's atomic program with Homi Bhabha and to India's sort of nuclear energy program, right? So in these different ways, it can lead to different sorts of results. And it also leads to India's data infrastructure, right? So that access does have that. I think it's also to do with a patrician mentality. Nehru and a lot of that government is from a certain elite, and they believe that they need to rely on certain kinds of people. As Nehru was not shy of saying, I prefer one technocrat to 4 bureaucrats, right? And he says that quite openly. And I think one of the reasons is this. There are other models at the time. There is the model that is, say, of the Praja Socialist Party, which had JP Narayan, Ram Manohar Lohia, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, etc. And they are arguing for a more Gandhian method to the economy. But that is, by the time that Gandhi is dead, in fact, even for the last 5-6 years of Gandhi's life, that is not really a mainstream option across the political spectrum in India. There isn't really a major political party in India that is arguing really that we should not have a centralized government, that we should have village-based decentralization. And so that sort of critique really falls on deaf ears because there's not much of a political constituency for that kind of critique. In fact, even the critique from the right, the critique not from the Hindu right, but from, say, the economic right of the Swatantra Party under Rajaji, C. Rajagopalachari, even that critique in some ways is many decades ahead of its time, right? Because there isn't the kind of middle class that will support that kind of politics. It is a country that is overwhelmingly poor. I mean, you're talking about less than 10% of the country being educated at the time, right? So it is a politics without a constituency, and I think that's why these technocrats have wide license. In terms of why does democratic planning and planning in India ignore caste, I think that this is a signal failure, of course, of the Indian economic experiment. Some would argue that that's a failure even of the neoliberal economic experiment, that in some ways that is a oversight that is shared across different kinds of economic ideas. One is that the Congress was, certainly is as well, an upper caste party. The idea of planning, and this is something that many types of socialism, whether Vedantic or communist, is guilty of, overlooks caste, right? Or thinks that the progress of a socialist economy will solve the issue of caste, and that caste is dissolvable in the progress towards an economic modernity that socialism will bring. And so they focus on planning consciousness, and that is believed to be the thing in which caste will sort of render itself into nothing. I think it's a similar kind of blindness with education and health. As I say, I don't go into those two aspects in the book, but as I say in the introduction, these are monumental failures. These are, I think, regardless of your political position on this, these are just absolutely Himalayan blunders on the part of the Indian state in its ignorance of primary education as opposed to building, say, universities and secondary education and primary healthcare. What I think is important to remember, though, despite passing judgment as an Indian citizen today, is that at the time, what were the options available? And it is not clear that it had been proven by countries then that for a recently decolonized nation that this is the best path forward. Right? Today we know from the evidence of China, especially after their investments in education and health in the 1950s and 60s, by the 80s and 90s you see a dividend in terms of a healthy and productive population. But at the time in the 1950s it's not clear. And I think that one way to look at planning in a more objective manner, for me, was to look at the views of critics of planning at the time. What are they saying about planning? And as Peter Bauer, who's a sort of English economist who's a lifelong critic of planning, says, unfortunately, the Mahalanobis model was the mainstream development economic model, not just in India, but also propounded by Western economists and Western aid agencies. So he is at the time lamenting the fact that not that the Indian project is idiosyncratic, but that actually the mainstream is entirely wrong. And he would be proven right in some ways later. But at the time, as even Jagdish Bhagwati, today a major critic of planning, says, at the time, we all believed it. At the time, we all drank the Kool-Aid. And as Jagdish Bhagwati himself said, perhaps one of the curses of India was our misfortune was to have brilliant economists. and our brilliant economists got things wrong, and he says, including me, and he said that all of us believed in this at the time, and that it was proven wrong from the late 1960s onwards, which is when he and Manmohan Singh turned away from this. So I'd say that partly it's to do with a certain tendency within the government, and partly to do also with the state of development economics at the time. About agriculture, this is certainly a model that is proposed by the Bombay School, which is that of Priya Brahmananda, C.N. Vakil, and B.R. Shenoy. But even they are marginal figures in Indian academia at the time, as they themselves would say. And as they say, there was groupthink at the time. And they say that at the time, being against the Mahalanobis model was seen amongst many people, including Jagdish Bhagwati, as being reactionary, as being hopelessly right-wing. In fact, P.R. Brahmananda recalls being touted as anti-nationalist, again, like sort of harkens back to today's time, being called anti-nationalist for being against the plan, being even suspected to be a CIA agent, right? I mean, this sort of conspiratorial thinking that if you're against this kind of thinking, that you must have anti-national interests at heart. And so you can see that this kind of, the anti-nationalist tag can be lobbed from the left and the right, as you see in Indian history. About Nehru and the Sadhu Samaj, I found this a very interesting relationship. I hope those of you who would read the book will also find this interesting. Nehru is seen as a sort of apogee of Indian secularism, yet he has these sadhus who are propagating the 5-year plans for him. And I found it a very funny relationship because Nehru is secular, but he is convinced over a long time by Rajendra Prasad and by Gulzar Lal Nanda that you have to get over your bashfulness about this for the 5-year plans to succeed. So in a sense, what do you care about more, secularism or the development of the economy? And so Nehru is sort of dragged kicking and screaming into this. Nehru, when he meets with the sadhus, it's very funny because he scolds them. Like he's ostensibly asking for their help, but every time he meets them, he's scolding them and berating them, saying that some of you are very good human beings, but some of you can scarcely be called human beings because you prey on the weaknesses of others. There were many reports at the time, the Times of India, about sadhus or people posing as sadhus, harassing women, raping women, abducting children. So there was this fear that there were fake sadhus. So the Bharat Sadhu Samaj sets up a registration process by which real sadhus would get an identity card and fake sadhus would not have the identity card, so you could separate the wheat from the chaff amongst the sadhus. All this is very ironic given that sadhus are meant to have given up the material world. The fact that they would wear nothing but carry an identity card with them to prove who they are sort of gives you a sense of the kind of stumbling blocks that this was bound to fall into. But by the time that the Sadhu Samaj goes really right-wing, Nehru's dead. By the time of the attack of the parliament is 1966, Nehru's been dead for 2 years. But some would say that Nehru should have known this is where it was headed, and certainly cartoonists of the era seem to think that this was sort of a tragedy, a slow-moving tragedy. Your last question about what do we make of centralization today versus the centralization of the Nehruvian era, I'd say that there are certainly similarities. There's certainly the similarities of self-reliance, which actually goes back even pre-Nehru to the Swadeshi movement, right, from the early 20th century. So Atmanirbharta goes back to a very early strain in Indian nationalism, but certainly was picked up and was associated with the Nehruvian government, but you certainly will not see this government saying that it has anything to do with Nehruvian socialism. But I think that the difference is that, one, there is the centralization of the 1950s was partly a response to an extraordinary scenario in which there was no nation and you are creating a nation. You are only a colony, right? Till August 15th, 1947, India is not a nation. India is a colony and you need to make a nation from this. And it was the belief of the Congress Party and the belief of someone like Ambedkar that that's why they rejected the Cabinet Mission Plan, because the Cabinet Mission Plan would have had a very decentralized India with Pakistan and today's Bangladesh as part of it. But each of these wings would basically have their own government with just a united army. And the idea was that India needed to be united in order to develop. So this was very much ingrained in the Congress ideology at the time. So creating a nation requires a certain level of centralization, which I think offers some cover for why the Congress wanted centralization, not necessarily to justify all their beliefs vis-a-vis the economy. But also, it is a different thing to have seen the benefits of federalism and then turn back the clock towards centralization than to go from colonialism to centralization, right? So I think that there are differences and that choice is different. The choice, again, without going into whether it is good or bad, the choice of going from colony to a centralized government, centralized independent government, is different from a trend towards federalism towards going back to centralization. So I think I'd say that those are the differences, apart from the the attitude towards expertise, which of course is a very big difference, which is not to say that experts always get it right. The history of planning shows that experts can get it wrong in many ways. Economists themselves admit to that. But there is a difference between getting things wrong in the way that planning got it wrong and the way in which, say, notebandi happens, the way in which demonetization happens, which is ignoring experts to do something. So you can sort of pick your poison then between, do you want to get it wrong with experts or without experts? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll open it up for audience.
Yeah. My name is G.B. Bagai. You mentioned that the citizen was faceless at the time of Nehru. It was all technocratic, I think, if I understood right. What is the situation now under the present dispensation? Because people seem to feel that they are now much more participative, they're much more passionate about their views. Is that because of lack of understanding of the facts, or is it because of the media and the publicity that people have developed their views, passionate views? Basically that. Are they more participative?
Sunday, would we have time for 3 questions if we just took them together? So should I take them together? Yeah.
One of the first states to challenge Nehruvian ideas was Kerala, your own state, where Marxism, Namboodiripad, EMS Namboodiripad started it. And later, much later, I don't know if as a historian I should be asking, there is this movement in Kerala, Kudumbashree. Have you studied that? I am told it has been working very well, but there is nothing much documented. Apparently, the tea estates and things like that, they had, because of the labor trouble and things like that, they were lying fallow. And then the women, the Kudumbashree movement, they joined together and engaged with the Tata Tea and other people and took over, asked the unions to step aside and took over, and now it is flourishing. I'm not very sure about it, but I read some articles to that effect. So is that working? Is that a good model? And another question that I have is, have you looked at universal basic income? Now, of course, there is already this MNREGA for the rural areas, and many governments, Aam Aadmi Party and things like that, is offering, these 3,000 rupees per, etc. Remove all that aside and universal basic income. I believe it has been tried out in some states in Korea, South Korea and things like that. Is that the way forward? I don't know if these are the questions that I should be asking a historian, but, well, I will anyway ask this. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. On the cartoon of R.K. Lakshman and people having to carry the plans, was there ever a vision for the Indian individual in the subcontinent to imbibe the spirit of scientific thinking for themselves at the individual level, the householder level? Was that a reason for why, regardless of clouds of ideology coming into the scientific process at the top, higher education institutions, the ISI, all of these institutions were scientific, aspirational in how they thought about things, but primary education, for example, was ignored? And was there ever this movement towards growing scientific thinkers outside of pockets of, Shantiniketan in Bengal, etc., at a mass level, is my question.
Yeah, hi. So my objection to your calling the democratic planning, because Indian model of planning is, Indian model of planning is it's a top-down approach, not bottom-up approach. So how can you call it as a democratic when it's an approach is top-down approach? So I have an objection. So, okay, that's what. Okay.
Thank you all for those questions. Regarding the first question, so there you are. What I was saying about people being faceless is the idea that planning, the idea of planning and the way it operated, that made the citizenry faceless in terms of the ideas that were being propounded, in that people were expected to implement them, but there was very little way in which the citizens could provide inputs into how plans could be conducted. I mean, I look into some of the ways in which they tried, but they failed. I would question the idea that people are more passionate today. I think that if you look at the editorials, you look at the literature, the writing from the era, I think that anything, we have a sort of present day bias, and so everything seems much more passionate today than in the past. But people, again, it might seem very surprising to many, but people were very, very, very passionate about the Congress Party. That's why it was in power for so long, right? And when you hear and you read about the kinds of spectacles at Nehru rallies, it is like any Modi rally. I mean, Nehru was as beloved, or perhaps more, I mean, you can, as today's prime minister is, right? And so you do have a sort of personality cult. You do have a huge swell of support in support of an individual. And I think that that is what allows for there to be a legitimacy, even though the citizens can't have an input into the planning process. So I think that that's the way in which it worked at the time. So regarding your question about Kudumbashree, unfortunately, I don't know too much about it. I certainly don't study it. But what you're describing sounds like the kind of model that planning could have adopted, but does not. The kind of sort of bottom-up approach, the kind of planning in which perhaps the state offers some indicational planning, but is not dictating sectoral outlays, not dictating how much, for example, certainly the kind of, certainly the real excesses of planning that creep in from the 70s and 80s onwards, that even critics of planning, like, say, Vivek Debroy, who works for the present-day government, the economist Vivek Debroy, even he says that the real license permit Raj kind of takes hold from the late 1960s onwards with bank nationalization, with the life insurance nationalization, etc., that is when it takes on this element in which companies cannot produce a certain amount because after that they have, they lose their protection. Companies need to go through, 50 or 60 licenses in order to do their daily work. But it sounds like that kind of cooperative model perhaps is another model that could have been attempted and perhaps should be in the future. About UBI, Universal Basic Income, again, this is just as not someone who studies Universal Basic Income, but as someone who just read about it. It sounds as though that it has been attempted more in countries that are much more affluent than ours. I know of a couple of Nordic countries that have attempted it, and South Korea has. So still much more affluent than ours. The questions of Universal Basic Income in terms of implementation is, one is, does it work? We don't have large-scale models yet to show whether it works or not. Secondly, do we have the money for it? Even if we scrap all of our populist, quote-unquote, populist programs, do we have money for it? And the third is a question of equity, which is that does an Indian who is getting less than the expected caloric intake per day deserve the exact same amount of money from the central government than I do? Or do that than many people in this room do, right? The point of universal basic income is that you cannot discriminate about how much people get, right? Everybody gets the exact same amount. So I think that there are questions of equity, and the questions of equity also then leads back to the question of which government will implement it, given that they need to get votes to do it. So I think that there are questions of implementation, questions of justice and equity, but also questions of how the politics of this will work. About the question about scientific temper, I mean, this, of course, is a famous phrase by Nehru. Nehru is committed to this. This is something that Nehru is giving a speechifying about at every opportunity that he gets. I mean, as I write in the book, that Nehru was one for just giving long, rambling speeches. But one thing that he did have was a sense of self-awareness. So as he would say, I lack expertise to speak about expert things, so I speak, generally about general things. And one of the general things he spoke about is scientific temper. And I think that it is borne out in his suspicion of culture and of religion in the realm of politics, not per se, but in the realm of politics. It is borne out in the kinds of scientific institutions that are built in the 1950s, many of which, I mean, most of our great scientific institutions come from that period and still exist till today. But it is also, that scientific temper is seen, the output of that scientific temper is the scientist, not the average citizen learning science as a child. Right? That is just seen as too heavy a lift for the country at the time. many people would say wrongly, that perhaps is what India should have been focusing on instead of building IITs and IIMs. Perhaps primary healthcare primary education should have been more of a focus. But then what are the trade-offs? I mean, again, economists could debate that. But there's a scientific temper, but perhaps misallocated. And so last, your question is about how can you call it democratic planning? I would say that I tried through half the book to make that claim, and I would encourage you to read it to see why I do it. But I also, the second half of the book is subtitled Democracy with a question mark. So I'm not saying democratic planning and agreeing with the government that it was democratic planning. The title is Democratic Planning because that's the slogan that the government used, and I try to poke holes in that and try to prove that though its aspirations might have been democratic, its implementation certainly was not. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you both for being wonderful discussants and interlocutors.
Thank you for writing this book. Those of you who haven't picked up his book, please do. It's a joy to read. You couldn't have thought that a book which is on plans could be such an exciting and such a nice read. Just like what Rajendran said, it's witty, it's funny, it makes you laugh in points, and it humanizes people actually. And that's the beauty of the book. So thank you so much for writing it.
And I would just add that I think, of course, the aspects of planning and data is brilliant, and the kind of picaresque characters that he talks about in the book is brilliant. I think if there's anything, Morton Nadler's, the description, to me, that was very different from the rest of the book, and I found that fascinating. If you like spy thrillers, read this book.